Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. In the quiet of the night, Alex lay still, cocooned in the heavy silence that filled the house. He should have been sleeping, but his mind was too active, latching onto shadows of doubt that had been lingering in the back of his mind. Then, a faint buzz cut through the silence of vibration from Sophia's phone, left on her side of the bed. It glowed softly in the darkness. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was another message from her late-night photography groups. But then the screen lit up with a preview of the message. He blinked, reading words that tightened the unease already pressing on his chest. "I can't wait to meet her." The words were simple, almost innocent in any other context, but here, in the stillness of their home, they carried a weight Alex couldn't ignore. He leaned closer, his heartbeat accelerating, the implications sharp and immediate. Who was this meant for? And more pressing, who was this person she planned to meet? Sophia shifted beside him, and he carefully withdrew, every movement cautious as he lay back, heart pounding. But in that moment, a resolve settled over him. He would find out the truth. The message had cracked something within him, and he felt the growing need to trace each fragment of doubt that, up until now, he had pushed aside. He'd gather the facts, piece by piece, until he understood exactly what was happening. For now, he remained quiet, his decision unspoken, watching Sophia as she slept peacefully beside him. In the days that followed, Alex couldn't shake the haunting weight of the message he'd seen. It was as though every glance, every lingering touch, and every laugh of Sophia's was tinged with a new meaning he couldn't interpret. He began to watch her closely, observing details he might have dismissed before, things like the way she hurried out the door with her camera bag, lingering hints of unfamiliar perfume, or how she often smiled to herself while texting. On the surface, everything seemed as usual between them, but Alex felt the growing divide like a physical presence. During breakfast, Sophia would mention her late-night photography projects or upcoming exhibitions, and Alex would nod along, masking his skepticism. But his mind kept wandering back to that message. "I can't wait to meet her." Who was her? What had his wife kept hidden from him? One evening, Alex found himself alone in the house, his eyes drifting to Sophia's phone on the kitchen counter. His fingers twitched with hesitation, feeling the tension between trust and the gnawing doubt clawing at him. He told himself that checking her messages was only to protect their marriage. Yet the thought of finding something undeniable, something final, filled him with dread. When he unlocked her phone, he scrolled carefully, his gaze scanning each message. They seemed innocent enough, mostly her friends or photographers discussing meetups and new projects. But then he found a contact with just a single initial R. Unlike her other messages, their conversation was filled with an unfamiliar warmth and occasional hints that seemed oddly intimate. Messages about meeting at secluded places to discuss the project or review portfolios surfaced over and over. As he read, Alex felt his chest tighten with each message. Sophia had never mentioned anyone named R before, and these secretive meetings, thinly veiled as work discussions, felt off, too casual, too cozy. The messages seemed harmless enough, yet his instincts told him otherwise. He locked the phone, returning it to the counter as his thoughts spun. The pieces were coming together, and yet he still didn't have the full picture. Over the next week, Alex began to gather evidence carefully, maintaining his composure while documenting her late arrivals, the new perfume bottles, and even unfamiliar charges on their joint credit card dinners at places he'd never been invited to. Each discovery added to the heavy feeling in his gut, but he pushed down the anger, replacing it with a growing resolve. He had decided he wouldn't confront her, not until he knew everything. But at night, as she lay sleeping beside him, he felt himself slipping further from her, weighed down by the knowledge he was quietly amassing. A part of him, however, wanted to be wrong, to uncover some perfectly innocent explanation that would dissolve the tension and restore their trust. But the signs were undeniable, each one a little crack in the foundation they'd built together. He decided to follow her the next time she went to one of her late-night shoots, determined to see the truth firsthand. For now, he waited, each hour a test of patience and self-control, as he drifted further into the role of an investigator in his own marriage. It was Friday night, and Sophia had told Alex she'd be out late again. This time she mentioned a sunset shoot with her photography group, one that apparently required her to drive to the outskirts of town. Alex nodded, playing the part of the supportive husband as he held back the questions that had been simmering under his calm exterior. Tonight he was done waiting for answers. He needed to see what was really happening. As she gathered her things, Alex noted the careful way she checked her phone, glancing at him briefly before slipping it into her bag. Her face was unreadable, a well-worn mask that made his stomach churn. She leaned in to give him a quick peck on the cheek, her gaze distant. Alex forced a smile, fighting down the bitterness he felt as she walked out the door. The moment her car disappeared down the street, he sprang into action, grabbing his keys and heading to his own car parked discreetly a few houses down. He kept his headlights off and followed her at a safe distance, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Street after street, she drove through town, making her way toward the highway that led to the outskirts. Alex stayed focused, careful not to get too close. As they left the city lights behind, he noticed her car veer off the main road onto a smaller, winding street that led to a secluded area overlooking the valley. Alex's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he slowed down, watching her car pull into a small parking lot beside an old trailhead. There were no other cars there, and she hadn't mentioned meeting anyone else tonight. He parked further down the road, watching as Sophia climbed out of her car, her eyes scanning the darkened area before she pulled her phone out, dialing quickly. Alex couldn't hear her, but he saw the way she nervously checked her surroundings, her posture tense. Moments later, the sound of a second car reached his ears, and headlights appeared on the winding road behind them. Alex's heart sank as a sleek black sedan pulled into the lot, parking next to her. A tall figure emerged, dressed casually in dark clothes. He couldn't make out the man's face, but there was no mistaking the way he moved toward Sophia, his posture relaxed and familiar. She greeted him with a quick embrace, her head resting briefly against his shoulder. The sight turned Alex's stomach, the weight of suspicion giving way to a bitter reality. They spoke for a while, close enough that it seemed impossible for them to be just friends. The man handed her something, perhaps a camera lens or equipment, but even in the darkness, Alex sensed this was more than a casual work exchange. He clenched his fists, his entire body tense, as he watched them walk to the edge of the overlook together, side by side, with the valley stretching below them like an endless shadow. Unable to tear his eyes away, Alex stayed rooted in his hiding spot, fury mixing with despair. The intimate scene before him shattered any lingering hope that this was innocent. And yet, he stayed still, letting the moment brand itself into his memory, knowing that everything between them had irrevocably changed. Alex drove home in a fog, the scenes he'd witnessed replaying in his mind like a film reel stuck on a loop. Sophia had returned to her car after an hour, her face softened by a secret contentment, a look Alex hadn't seen in her for months. He had waited until she left, gripping the steering wheel with enough force that his hands were still numb, his anger smoldering beneath the surface. Back in the quiet of their home, Alex paced the living room, feeling both lost and alert, adrenaline and dread intertwining. He moved through the house as if searching for some fragment of normalcy, something familiar to anchor himself. The pictures on the wall, the carefully arranged decor Sophia had chosen, even the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, it all felt like a mocking reminder of the life they built, now cast under suspicion. Finally, he sat down, staring at the coffee table, his thoughts hardening into a new resolve. He would dig deeper, uncover every detail of this affair. Sophia might be keeping secrets, but she was still living under the same roof, still leaving traces of her actions. Alex wanted the truth, every ugly piece of it. The next morning, Sophia moved around the house as if nothing was amiss, humming softly as she prepared coffee, her movements light. Alex studied her, keeping his expression carefully neutral. She'd glance at him now and then, her gaze flitting away whenever he held her stare a little too long. He forced a smile, a bitter echo of the man he used to be, and quietly prepared himself to dig further. As she left for her next shoot the following evening, Alex turned his attention to her laptop. He knew Sophia used her computer for editing photos, storing portfolios, and communicating with clients, but he had never once felt compelled to look through it. Now, as he scrolled through her emails, a new hidden world began to surface. At first, the messages were innocuous conversations with colleagues, photography newsletters, reminders of upcoming events. But as he dug deeper, his patience paid off. Buried under layers of work emails were messages exchanged with R, the same contact from her phone. They were infrequent, but each one carried a tone of secrecy, alluding to private meetings and shared confidences. One message stood out. "Last night was incredible. I can't wait until we have more time." Alex felt his chest tighten, the cold confirmation striking him. Each message was a small piece of evidence, but combined, they painted a damning picture. As he read further, another thread of conversation caught his eye, a set of deleted messages in the trash folder. He restored them, his stomach sinking as he scanned through the lines. These weren't simple, casual exchanges. They were laced with inside jokes, shared moments, plans for the next rendezvous. For the first time, Alex felt the extent of her betrayal hit him with full force. The emotions he had been holding back rushing in. Sophia had been careful, deleting her tracks and keeping her phone close, but these emails were enough. He had uncovered the truth, yet he was left with the impossible question of what to do next. That night, when Sophia returned home, Alex pretended to be asleep, his back turned to her. He felt her slip into bed beside him, close but distant, her presence only deepening his pain. He lay awake for hours, waiting for the right moment to act. The evidence was there. All that remained was the decision he knew he'd have to make. The next few days stretched on like an unending test of Alex's patience and self-control. Every time he looked at Sophia, he saw the stranger he'd glimpsed that night with him, her lover, someone who could smile, laugh, and go through their daily routines while hiding an entire life from him. Each interaction felt hollow, laden with unspoken words that simmered beneath the surface, threatening to crack his composure. But Alex was done playing the passive husband. He'd gathered the evidence, now he was determined to use it to his advantage. If she wanted to lie and deceive, he would play her game. He began his own subtle deceptions, dropping questions into their conversations, testing her responses for signs of guilt or hesitation. He would casually ask about her photography sessions or her late-night editing, and he'd watch her closely, noting every fleeting expression that crossed her face. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, he decided to take it a step further. "So how was your shoot last night?" he asked, his voice light but loaded with a quiet undertone of tension. Sophia glanced up, her fork pausing mid-air. "Oh, it was fine," she said, with an offhandedness that made Alex's anger pulse. "We had a lot of material to cover, so I ended up staying later than planned." "Oh, where did you end up going?" Alex pressed, holding her gaze with a hint of challenge. Sophia's eyes flickered for a split second, her practiced calm slipping. She recovered quickly, brushing off his question with a soft laugh. "Just the usual spots," she said, dropping her gaze to her plate. "You know how it is. I've shown you photos from there before." Alex nodded, suppressing the bitter smile that tugged at his lips. Her response felt rehearsed, as though she'd anticipated his questions. He could see it now, the carefully curated performance she gave him to maintain the facade of normalcy. But as she resumed eating, Alex's mind was already working through his next step. The following night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Alex made his way quietly to her car. He knew it was risky, but he needed to see if she'd left any further traces. Slipping inside, he switched on his phone's flashlight, his gaze scanning every corner. After a few moments of searching, his fingers brushed over a small slip of paper wedged between the seat and the center console. He pulled it out, his pulse racing as he unfolded it. It was a receipt for a restaurant on the other side of town, a place they'd never gone together. The date on the receipt was from just a few nights ago, aligning perfectly with one of her so-called shoots. His suspicions now confirmed, Alex felt a surge of cold determination. The signs were all there, woven seamlessly into the fabric of her lies. Returning to the house, he tucked the receipt away with the other pieces of evidence he'd gathered. He no longer questioned her betrayal, he'd seen and heard enough. Now, his focus shifted to the inevitable confrontation he'd been dreading, the one that would bring everything out into the open. But he would wait, make her feel the weight of her own secrecy, and watch as the wall she'd built around herself began to crumble. In the meantime, he made subtle changes around the house, small enough that she wouldn't notice immediately. He rearranged his schedule to stay late at work, became uncharacteristically distant, replying to her questions with vague answers. Alex was no longer a passive observer in his own life. He'd begun to turn the tables, playing the role of a husband who knew nothing but who quietly observed everything. All that remained now was to decide how and when to make his final move. Days passed, and Alex settled into his quiet game, maintaining a facade of calm indifference, while Sophia carried on as if nothing had changed. He continued to gather every scrap of evidence he could find, each discovery adding fuel to the cold fire burning within him. He felt his resentment harden, transforming him from the passive, trusting husband he once was into a man determined to take control of the narrative. One evening, as Sophia got ready for yet another late-night editing session, he noted the way she carefully picked out her clothes, a simple blouse that looked just a bit too elegant for a casual night of work. She sprayed on a perfume he'd never seen her wear around him, a light floral scent that drifted through the room, carrying with it a wave of bitterness. Every step in her routine seemed calculated, deliberate, as if she were preparing for a date rather than a work commitment. It was all Alex could do to keep his expression neutral as she caught his eye in the mirror. "Don't wait up for me, okay?" she said, throwing him a fleeting smile before turning away. "Of course," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Enjoy your night." She left, and the house plunged into silence. The quiet felt like a pressure building around him, a suffocating reminder of the lies Sophia had woven around them both. But tonight he was ready to break free from the role of silent observer. He knew where she was going. He had pieced together enough her movements to understand her patterns, her favorite meeting spots with art. Tonight, he would go further than merely watching from a distance. After waiting long enough to ensure she'd arrived at her destination, Alex slipped on his coat and left, driving toward the secluded area where he'd tracked her before. The road was dark and deserted, his headlights cutting through the shadows as he navigated the narrow curves leading to the overlook. He parked a distance away and walked quietly to a vantage point, his heart pounding as he approached. From his position, he could see her car parked near the same black sedan he'd seen before. Sophia stood next to it, leaning into the figure of her lover as they laughed, their voices carrying faintly through the crisp night air. She touched his arm, her fingers lingering, and the casual intimacy of it felt like a knife twisting in Alex's chest. They were relaxed, unguarded, like two people who had no reason to hide. And in that moment, Alex felt the last fragments of his restraint break. He moved closer, stopping just out of sight behind a cluster of trees. The couple was deep in conversation, oblivious to everything around them. Every word he overheard was a confirmation of what he'd feared, phrases filled with endearments, plans for weekends away, laughter laced with secrets. Each word felt like a wound, raw and cutting. As he listened, a new plan formed in his mind, one that would be far more devastating than any confrontation he could have imagined. He no longer wanted a dramatic, angry exchange, nor did he want Sophia's tearful explanations or denials. He wanted silence and exit as quiet and final as the betrayal that had stolen away his peace. Alex took one last look at the scene before him, memorizing every detail, then turned back toward his car. He knew exactly how he would respond, and the realization settled over him like a cold, impenetrable calm. He would be gone before she ever had a chance to explain. Returning home that night, Alex felt an eerie calm settle over him. The clarity of his decision brought a surprising sense of peace, like the eye of a storm that had raged within him for too long. The next steps played out in his mind, each one a deliberate move in the quiet, controlled exit he now envisioned. He wouldn't waste energy on a confrontation or an emotional showdown. Sophia would never get the satisfaction of an explanation. Instead, he would leave her with the same silence and mystery she had given him. Over the following days, Alex began making quiet preparations, ensuring that each piece would fall perfectly into place. He started at work, speaking with his supervisor about an upcoming project that would require him to relocate temporarily to the company's other office across the state. The move, he explained, would be beneficial to their team, and given his years with the firm, they were more than willing to accommodate him. It was a legitimate opportunity, but to Alex, it also served as a clean break from the life he shared with Sophia. In the house, he moved with caution, gathering his personal items bit by bit, concealing his intent from her. He packed only what he truly needed, carefully leaving things she wouldn't immediately notice were gone. Every night, while she thought he was asleep beside her, he lay awake, planning the final details of his departure. He thought of the wedding photos, the souvenirs from their trips, even the notes they'd left each other over the years, all symbols of a life that felt foreign to him now. Each item seemed hollow, tainted by her lies, and he found no reason to cling to any of it. Sophia, meanwhile, seemed blissfully unaware, carrying on with her usual routines, still leaving on her so-called work nights, and returning with that quiet satisfaction he now understood all too well. She would sometimes ask him if everything was okay, noting that he seemed distant, but Alex would only smile, brushing off her questions with a light comment about work or fatigue. He realized now that she saw only what she wanted to see, content in her double life. Her blindness to his unraveling only strengthened his resolve to leave without a word. By the end of the week, Alex's plans were nearly complete. He'd transferred his savings into a separate account, finalized the arrangements at work, and spoken with a real estate agent about listing the house. His departure would be as swift as it was quiet. When she came home one night, he simply wouldn't be there. On his final night in their shared home, he left one last mark, a quiet reminder of the truth she'd tried so hard to hide. He wrote a brief note and placed it in an envelope on her nightstand, a simple message that would make her realize he knew everything without him having to say a word. "For all the nights you weren't really working," he wrote, the words stark and cold against the blank paper. He left the envelope by her phone where she would find it the next morning. In the early hours of dawn, as the house lay silent, he slipped out, his belongings packed in the trunk of his car. The weight of his decision was light, freeing, as he drove away, leaving the empty shell of their life behind him. He had no desire to look back, no need for closure beyond the quiet exit he had orchestrated. Whatever Sophia felt when she found the note was her burden to bear. He was already gone. Sophia awoke the next morning, the familiar sound of her alarm breaking the early quiet. She reached out instinctively for Alex's side of the bed, only to find it empty and cold. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. It was unusual for him to be gone so early. Still groggy, she reached for her phone on the nightstand, but her fingers brushed against a small envelope instead. Confused, she picked it up, recognizing Alex's handwriting on the outside. Her heartbeat quickened as she opened it, the simple message inside sending a cold wave of shock through her. For all the nights you weren't really working. The words cut through her like ice, stark and final. Her mind raced, each carefully concealed lie unraveling under the weight of his words. She sat up, scanning the room as if expecting him to emerge from some hidden corner. But the house was silent, eerily so. Sophia hurried through the rooms, checking for any sign of him, hoping to find his keys on the counter, his coat on the rack, anything that suggested he was still here. But room after room confirmed the truth: Alex was gone. She could feel it in the emptiness of the house, a hollowness that mirrored the sudden void in her chest. Her gaze landed on their framed wedding photo on the mantel, the two of them smiling under the golden light of a day that now felt like a distant memory. It was the life they had built together, filled with promises she thought she could keep, and yet here she was, the pieces of it scattered around her like fragments of glass. The enormity of her mistake settled over her, each memory with Alex now tinged with the bitter realization that she had been the one to break what they had shared. In desperation, she dialed his number, only to be met with the cold, impersonal tone of his voicemail. She left a shaky message, her voice catching. "Alex, please, let's talk. I didn't mean for things to," but she trailed off, realizing how hollow the words sounded, even to her. She ended the call, her hand trembling as she let the phone drop to her side. As the day wore on, she tried calling mutual friends, hoping they might know where he'd gone, but no one had heard from him. It became clear that Alex had planned his departure meticulously, leaving no loose ends for her to grasp. She thought back to the last few weeks, replaying conversations, moments when he'd seemed distant, but she dismissed them, too wrapped up in her own deception to notice his growing silence. Each memory brought fresh regret, an unyielding realization that she'd been so focused on her own secrecy that she hadn't seen the signs right in front of her. By evening, Sophia sat alone in the darkened living room, her phone silent and her calls unanswered. The weight of Alex's absence pressed down on her, a hollow ache that seemed to grow with every passing hour. She could still smell his cologne faintly in the room, a ghostly reminder of everything she had lost. She clung to that scent, hoping that somehow it would help her hold on to a part of him, something she could still feel, even as the rest of him faded away. Days turned into weeks, each one marked by the emptiness he had left behind. Friends reached out, sensing something was wrong, but Sophia had no words to explain the loss she felt. Alex had taken not just his presence but also the stability, the grounding she had once taken for granted. She tried reaching out again, desperate to hear his voice, to tell him she was sorry, to beg him for a chance to rebuild what they had, but her calls always met the same silent rejection. Eventually, Sophia understood that this silence was her answer. Alex had left her with the same quiet betrayal she'd given him, the unspoken truth lying heavy between them, a final, irrevocable end to a love she had once held but had let slip through her fingers.